Everybody, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if other people join, then Gabby will let them in due time. And so I'm going to run through a whole host of slides here talking about complete streets. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. My colleague Gabby will try to grab those questions and I can answer them. So what I'm saying is you don't have to wait till the very end to ask questions, but you can certainly also wait till the end to ask questions as well. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a quick update on Local Motion, who we are, who I am, and I'm assuming most of the people on this Zoom are familiar with who we are, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but again, if you have questions, ask. And then I'm going to go in and talk a little bit about what complete streets are. And that way you have some strong background knowledge on what they are. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what our opinion at Local Motion is on complete streets and talk a little bit about what we hope to see change into the future with complete streets here in Columbia. So with that, I'll get started. So who we are, I mentioned we are Local Motion. We are a bunch of policy, infrastructure, and transportation nerds. We spend a lot of time studying our transportation system. We are not engineers. We do not straight up design roadways. But what we tend to do is look at what is known as transportation theory. So what is the best way to move people through a community, through our state, through our neighborhoods, through business districts, and we look at transportation theory to figure out what's the most efficient and economically and equitable way to move people through our communities. We are an advocacy organization. So most people assume non-for-profits. When they think of a non-for-profit, they think of direct services. We don't really have a lot of direct services that we provide out into the public. And when you think of direct service agencies, you think of people feeding the hungry, housing our unhoused neighbors. And so those are some direct service type of agencies. What we are is an advocacy organization. And I like to explain that to people as best as I can, because even today, my mom, I'll call her today and she'll even ask me, what the heck is it that you do? And she doesn't understand what advocacy is. Basically, what we are is we are promoting a vision. And we have this vision, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And we want to see the world change to look like that vision. And so we spend our time doing everything we can, either through education, through programs, through events, through talking to people, trying to have people buy into our vision, and then move all of our policies in our built environment to match what that vision is. Sometimes I like to joke and say that we're like a lobbyist, but we're doing it for good, and we have souls. And we also don't make nearly as much money as a lobbyist does. We are independent, non-for-profit. Sometimes people think we're part of some national non-for-profit. We're not. We're very local. We focus heavily here in Columbia. A lot of times people think we're associated with the city because we spend a lot of time talking about policy, working in communities, and talking about diagrams that you see here on the slide that I'm sharing with you all. I mentioned that we're local. We focus heavily here in Columbia. We do also do work outside of Columbia. We obviously know that things that happen at the state capitol can eventually influence what happens here in our city. And so we have a statewide arm, Missourians for Responsible Transportation, who is housed in our office, that does a lot of the statewide work for us. They basically do all the stuff that we do here in Columbia, but they do it on a statewide level, either at the city capitol or in smaller communities all throughout Missouri. So I mentioned our vision a bit ago. Our vision is simple. We just want towns built for people, where it's easy to walk, bike, and ride transit, and everyone can get where they want to go. So simple enough. What's our mission? How do we accomplish that vision? Well, we provide walking, biking, and transit solutions to meet people's everyday transportation needs. And I like to describe that a little bit. Most often, in fact, I met with a gentleman earlier this week, he said, oh, I thought you just want to try to get everybody to ride bikes. And that's not completely accurate. We hope that more people will ride bikes. We hope that more people will walk and use public transit when our vision comes to fruition. However, our goal is to view things from a lens that says, okay, if you bring us a problem, what is going to make it best for what part of the solution is going to make it best for people walking, biking, or using public transit. And whatever that solution is, what we have found through our research, through case studies, and through practice, that if whatever your solution is into your community makes it better for biking, walking, and public transit, it's generally going to be the best solution all around. 99% of the time, that's going to be the case. So we view everything from that lens of one, equity, walking, biking, and public transit. So you can bring us an issue such as zoning codes, student housing downtown, shoveling sidewalks, whatever it is, trash, we can talk about it and tell you our position on it as it relates to walking, biking, and public transit. And we are willing to bet that it'll be the best solution for Columbia. So what we do, I mentioned we're an advocacy organization. So what we do is we advocate for policies and infrastructure that ensure the transportation system is safe and convenient for everyone. And that term everyone is bolded for a reason, because we believe it should be for everyone. We believe it should work very well for an 8-year-old. We believe it should work very well for an 80-year-old. We should believe it should work very well for a person in a wheelchair who's sight impaired. And the reason we believe that is because if it works exceptionally well for those individuals, it's going to work exceptionally well for every other individual in a community, no matter where you're coming at it from life. You know, if you are currently a very able-bodied individual in a very privileged position, if we design our community and our transportation system to be safe and convenient for that 8-year-old, that 80-year-old, the wheelchair user, it's also going to be really great for you as well. However, if we tend to just focus on the very privileged, the very able-bodied, and we say, let's just make it very good for that person, it's generally going to fail every other individual in our community, or it's going to get very difficult for them to get around our community. So what do we do? Or why we do, excuse me. We do this because, and I mentioned before, we do a lot of research, we do a lot of case studies, we do a lot of practice, and what we have found that communities that are walkable, bikeable, and accessible have thriving public transit systems. They tend to be stronger, they are more equitable, they are happier, and this has been shown by research, by studying, by science, that communities that you're able to walk more, bike more, and have a thriving public transit system, you are happier. So it's a huge thing to have. Most people undervalue how wonderful happiness is in our life. It is better for business. Places that are walkable, bikeable, or have public transit tend to have much more revenue generated for themselves. They tend to be much more stable businesses, and they tend to have much happier employees and employers. So that's why we do a lot of this work. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? Because that's really what non-for-profits do. They are in the business of covering a gap that our society has. They are here to solve a problem that our society has. And so what we are trying to do is we are trying to solve the problem of Columbia's current road design standards. The thing with Columbia's road design standards is that they are incredibly outdated. The most recent Columbia road design standard, the last time they were updated in our community was in 2004. And even still, even though they were updated in 2004, that standard that was updated then is still really just based in standards that really haven't changed much since about the 1940s. So they are incredibly outdated. They are also incredibly inequitable. They're incredibly inequitable because they tend to only focus on what prioritizes the automobile. When we prioritize the automobile, that makes it very difficult for any other road user, whether you're walking, biking, using a wheelchair, depending on what age you are. It also makes it very inequitable based on your finances. Cars are an incredibly expensive an incredibly expensive tool. You know, on average in the United States, as a report out by AAA, it costs an American $9,000 annually to own and operate a car. Obviously, some people are spending more than that, some spending less than that. And we believe that is an incredible injustice that you have to spend that much amount of your money just to participate in society, get around our community, and meet the things that you need for your everyday life. Our current road design standards are incredibly dangerous. A lot of people either don't know this or they tend to shrug it off, which is disheartening. But in the United States, we tend to see about 40,000 deaths from traffic violence on our roads. We tend to see close to 3 million serious injuries on our road system. Now, when I say serious injuries, I don't mean like you got hurt and you ended up in the hospital for a couple of days, and then after 6 months to a year, you're fully recovered. When I say serious injury, I mean you have a life-altering event that you are forever changed. So you may now have a disability for the rest of your life. Something has occurred to you that significantly changed, and that's just tragic. If you put that into context, that is basically a 3,000 people dying a month. And we would never, if that was a plane crash, if a plane was crashing every month with 3,000 and having 3,000 people die, we would say, airline industry, you need to do something differently. But yet we've never done that with our transportation system. Our transportation system is incredibly inefficient. I don't think I have to sell anybody on this. We all know how frustrating it can be when you're trying to travel across town in an automobile and you're not going very far, maybe 3 miles, but yet it still takes you 15, 20 minutes in a car to get across town. It's incredibly inefficient. And there's a reason for this. It's because we force everybody to use the biggest, most expensive type of transportation system to get from point A to point B. I recently heard an example of this. If you can imagine, if everybody was forced to get on a plane and they all had to do carry-on, but they all had to use the largest piece of suitcase they could possibly use, everybody was forced to use that largest piece of suitcase, it would be incredibly difficult to board that plane and to store all of your luggage. And so there are more efficient ways to move people throughout our cities that allow people to get by foot, by walking, as I mentioned, transit, biking, and even doing some zoning differences that allow businesses such as hospitals and grocery stores and schools to be located nearer and nearer to the neighborhoods in which we live. It's incredibly expensive to build this way. The way we design our roads is by far the most expensive in the developed world. And that says something, seeing how it's also the most inefficient, the most dangerous, the most inequitable, and the most outdated. They are also incredibly unpleasant. The road in this picture, which you see, I call this any road anywhere in the United States because this is the most common road design anywhere. The examples I can give you of right here in Columbia are Business Loop 70. You can think of College Boulevard, in some cases Providence. And so it's a very common road design. They're very unpleasant. And as you can see, this individual who's walking down this road, they are not having a good time. I can guarantee it because they are not in a safe place. It's just not a pleasant place to be. This also tends to be the type of places where businesses struggle the most. Think about where businesses really thrive and do really well. Think about where there's lots of people walking and biking. That tends to be the same two places. And so these are the problems we are trying to solve. So what our goal is for 2022 is we want to produce a cutting edge, modern, complete streets policy. And I'll start to transition my talk a little bit here into what is a complete streets policy to give you all a little bit better understanding of what it is. We want to include modern, equitable street design standards, and we want the city to adopt these standards by the end of 2022. So that's what we're trying to work on. That's our goal, to fix that problem that I just discussed. So what are street design standards? That's one word I've used a few times, and I want to talk about what a street design standard is so that you all know what it is, or that we can be on the same page as we continue to discuss. So a street design standard is a city policy that determines what a street looks like. If you remember back on that second slide I showed, and it had a look very engineering cross-section of a road, that is a street design standard. It determines your driving lane widths, it determines the sidewalk widths, crosswalks, if there are any, lighting, if there is any, bike lane, what type, what width it is, the accessibility, are there audible crosswalks, are there curb cuts? It determines what kind of traffic calming there is, such as street trees, landscaping, street furniture. And this is determined for every type of road within our city. So whether it's a neighborhood road, that may be something like a Ash or a Whirly, or it could be something even smaller than that. It could also be things such as Providence and up to Stadium. And we even have road design standards for things like I-70. So why do street design standards matter? Street design standards matter because they'll determine if a street is safe, but not only is it safe, but who is it safe for? That's what's the really important question as we continue to move forward. Who is the street safe for? And as I mentioned before, right now we're seeing in the United States close to 40,000 deaths on our transportation system. So I argue that it's not really safe for anybody. Safety determines whether people walk, bike, or ride transit, especially perceived safety. And I think that's something that's often missed, is oftentimes people will say, oh, it's perfectly safe. But if you don't feel safe, you're not going to use it. If you don't feel safe, you're not going to let your kid use it to walk to school. If you don't feel safe, you are not going to use it no matter what. So safety is a huge piece of this, but really I want to focus on that perceived safety. It needs to feel safe. I like to use the example outside of our office, which we're on Broadway and at the corner of Broadway and Garth. There's a school there, there's the public library there, there's neighborhoods nearby. We have a big wide sidewalk out in front of our office, but very, very few people actually walk up and down that. And it's because it's bumped right up against 4 lanes of fast moving traffic, aggressive moving traffic, I might add, if you know the situation over here. And so very few people like using that. And so you don't see as many kids walking to, say, Garth or the library as you should probably see. So how did we get here a little bit? A short history. You know, back in the 1800s, we didn't have bikes, we didn't have cars. And when we designed our transportation system, we did everything we could. And the straighter the line on this graph or this diagram shows the convenience. So obviously we made it very convenient for people walking and people riding horses. As we moved to the 1900s, the bike is introduced. We recognize that as that's a human scale when people ride bikes. And so we still made it very convenient for people walking, biking, and using a horse. We also had tram or light rail starting to come in at that point. And we started to recognize that we still wanted to make sure that it was as safe and convenient for the people that were more on the human scale side. And so the tram tended to be a little less convenient. It tended to not go straight down the main thoroughfare. It kind of weaved a little bit and was a little bit out of the way. As we move into the 1920s, not as many people were riding horses at that time, so the horses drop off. We're still thinking about the human scale as being the most important. You know, people walking and biking, they should have the priority. They should have the safety. They should have the greatest convenience. Tram is still a little inconvenient, but cars started to come in. Only the wealthy, the rich, the very privileged had cars at that time. And they were also seen as incredibly dangerous. In fact, there was a huge movement in the 1920s. If you remember the movement we recently had with our bird scooters, it was very similar to the movement in 1920s when cars started showing up in our cities. However, cars were being brought in by wealthy hobbyists, wealthy rich people who bought the cars, and they didn't care that people were on the roads and they wanted to drive through those roads. And unfortunately, their money and influence changed the way our streets look forever, because they were able to stop the public outcry from saying get cars out of our cities, and actually started to move people and bikes and things like light rail and buses more out of our city to bring the car in. And then 1950 to present, what you see is we've now developed a transportation system that the car has the greatest ease, has the greatest safety design for it, and every other mode of transportation is considered secondary and is not very convenient and is generally very unsafe within our communities. So we talked a little bit earlier about street design and what a street design is. That's that more boring engineering kind of cross section. And now I want to talk a little bit about what complete streets are. A complete street will be safe and convenient for people walking, biking, riding transit, people with disabilities, children, people of color, and will also be safe for people driving. Specifically, complete streets should be designed and operated to prioritize safety and comfort and access to destinations for everyone. We've talked a lot about that already, especially people that are current transportation system places at high risk. So when we're talking about a complete street, what we're talking about is the street shouldn't be just built for one mode of transportation. It should be built for all modes of transportation. So here's again that road design or street design. And this is one that, is what we would consider a complete street. It has a median, it has some travel lanes, it has bike lanes, it has sidewalks, it has room for trees. And so this is something what we would call a complete street. And the road design shows that. So not only do we have a complete street, but we've now built it into our design. To show you a little difference, this is considered a street rendering. This is a little bit less formal, tends to be more artistic and to help give a concept of the design so people can have draw a better picture in their head of what the more boring street design may look like as a street rendering. This is a great street rendering. It really shows how bikes and walking can be incorporated into a downtown district. There are street renderings similar to this for your neighborhoods and for places like Providence and College. And these are wonderful. Like I said, the only thing they're missing is that kind of how wide is everything, some of the more design pieces of it. And this is not a unrealistic design that we couldn't incorporate into downtown. Downtown is very walkable, it's very bikeable, but it's certainly not as walkable or bikeable as it could be. And so there's even work in what we would consider our most walkable, bikeable place of Columbia that could be done to make it even better. So currently, we do have a complete streets policy here in Columbia that says when we build a road, we need to make sure we consider every road user. We need to make sure it accommodates bikes, it accommodates people walking, what's the public transit service going to be, disabled people and cars. And I use the word accommodate. So that means they are allowed there. Our personal opinion about the way our complete streets policy is implemented is it gives lip service to those other modes of transportation. And I use this picture as kind of a joke because this is how we view our complete streets policy. We basically think that, yes, we've provided a space for, say, in this picture, somebody in a wheelchair to go up and down that staircase. But it's a joke because we know that that's not safe, convenient, or usable at all for that person in the wheelchair. And that's really how we kind of feel about our current complete streets policy, as well as our road design standards here in Columbia. Yes, we have bike lanes, but would you take your family on many of the bike lanes we have around Columbia to bike to a store or to bike to a grocery or to bike to school? No, most people using those bike lanes right now are people that would use a bike or ride their bikes anyway. We just haven't given them a piece of paint that makes them feel like they have a space on the road, but it doesn't provide any true safety. My example of this, or at least one of my examples of this, is Business Loop. Again, this is that any road, anywhere in the United States type of road, most common road design standard. Business Loop is considered a complete street. Now, I want to give Business Loop credit where credit is due. They are doing a lot of work there to try to make their street as bike friendly, as pedestrian friendly, and public transit friendly as possible. They got a ways to go yet, but they're putting in a big effort. But currently, it does have bike lanes. It sort of has sidewalks, but no one here would say this area prioritizes people walking or biking, or even gives them equal footing as people driving. Nobody says, hey, honey, you want to go down the Business Loop? We'll park somewhere. We'll enjoy a stroll up and down the street. We'll pop into some businesses. Maybe we'll pop into Popeyes, get some dinner, and then go over to Carpet One and just have a nice evening looking at some new carpet we might buy. Nobody says that. And the reason they don't say that is because it's not walkable. It's not bikeable. It's not a friendly environment to be. It's not a place. What Business Loop tends to be is a place you cut through, or if you have one destination you need to get to, you can kind of get there by car. Because I would argue that even driving there in a car, it's very unpleasant. It's also very unsafe. It is one of the roads in our town that has the highest rates of people getting killed and seriously injured on it. And so even though this is considered a complete street, it just does not do what the policy was intended for it to do. Another example I like to give is Clark Lane. I think Clark Lane, when I moved here in 2010, moved to Columbia, I heard our community screaming loud at the top of their lungs, we need a good sidewalk on Clark Lane as it goes east. Here we are 12 years later, and there's still no sidewalk on it. Okay, but in this section, there is a sidewalk. Oh, and there is a little bit of a bike lane and a sharrow. This road is considered a complete street. However, not many people walk here. The people that are walking here are the people that have no other choice. It's not a pleasant place to be. In fact, the area we are looking at here on the left side, about a year or two ago, a young woman was struck and killed by a car there, walking home from McDonald's, walking home from work. She was working to get to her home. It was a very tragic story, and yet we still can't get a sidewalk on there, and yet this is considered a complete street. Providence Road, not necessarily a complete street in the sense that, you know, it doesn't necessarily have a sidewalk, it doesn't have a bike lane, but we don't believe that a sidewalk and bike lane is necessary in every single place. But considerations need to be made if there isn't. And what we're showing here is on the right, though, there is a public transit stop. So when the person gets off the bus at this public transit stop, where are they supposed to go? They can walk through the grass. Well, what if they're in a wheelchair? They can't walk through that grass. And so what we're showing here again is another example of we've given high priority to one mode of transportation and made anybody else that's using a different type of mode of transportation a second-class citizen. There's that bus stop. Knife on Boulevard. This is a new enough road or a new enough redesigned road that it falls under our complete street standards. You'll see that off to the right, there's a sidewalk. There is a bike lane here, but also notice that it's 50 miles an hour. Even the most hardy person riding a bike does not ride on Nifong unless they absolutely have to. And so we are still, as an example, not doing what we need to do to make people that need to get around our community by other modes of transportation safe and convenient. So our recommendation is to focus on equity. We really want our community, as I mentioned, I just went through what we think our complete streets policy, what we think about our complete streets policy currently, but we want to update it and make it something new, something more advanced, something that focuses on equity. Particularly what you're seeing here is a bunch of roads. It's our crash map, and it shows our high crash network. It shows the roads that we have the most deaths and serious injuries on. It also shows the areas of town as it relates to income and color. And so what we tend to find is places that have high crashes, they have a certain type of road design, they have a certain type of speed on them, and they also tend to be situated near places with lower income individuals living in them or people of color. And so we want to focus on those areas and focus heavily on equity. And these are some of our recommendations that we see that can help update the complete streets policy to be something that we can be proud of and says that, yes, we are doing what we need to do for people outside of their cars. Number one, we need to prioritize maintenance and updating versus new infrastructure and sprawl. I mentioned to you all here on Clark Lane, this is a sidewalk issue that I've heard about for years. We've seen people get killed on this roadway, yet over 12 years, nothing has been done to update this road and make it safe for people walking and biking. And there are tons of businesses here, tons of employees that walk around this area, use the bus around this area. There are neighborhoods behind us on this street, lots of neighborhoods that people are trying to get to and from. Yet, we didn't spend money here. We spent money here. This is Discovery Parkway. This is a $10 million project in the middle of nowhere. This has no equity implications. Nobody is struggling to get from point A to point B out here on this Discovery Parkway extension. Whereas I guarantee you, people are struggling to get to their jobs, to the grocery stores, wherever they need to go along this road. Nobody's struggling out here, and yet we're spending $10 million to build a road out in the middle of nowhere. But yet, when we ask about Clark Lane, we're told there's not enough money in the budget to put a sidewalk along Clark Lane. We want to prioritize biking, walking, and public transit. Some people that say, well, I have to drive, I'm going to always have to drive. I don't like that. I don't like that you're prioritizing something other than me. Well, once again, we hear what's known as privilege. You don't understand how privileged you are. And as soon as we try to make it equitable for somebody else, you feel like you are getting the shaft. Well, that's not the case at all. Cars have a vastly higher benefit when it comes to safety, convenience, and the amount of money we put into that mode of transportation. We would like to see prioritizing biking, walking, and public transit, and we really want to focus on their safety and convenience, because we also know that if we do that, the people that always will have to drive, because people will always drive, the car isn't going anywhere. But if we prioritize these other modes of transportation, it gets better for drivers. It gets people off the road. It makes for a calmer driving environment. It makes it easier for them to access the places they need to go. We've seen this time and time again after study after study, after case study after case study. In fact, you can look at what's the best place and what's the best city to drive, when you look around the world. Inevitably, the places that say best place to drive is also the places that have the best biking, walking, and public transit infrastructure. And so we want to start seeing infrastructure like what you see here in this picture, where there's great sidewalks for people to walk, great bike lanes for people to bike on, separated from automobile traffic, to where you, your kid, your grandparent, whoever feels very safe walking and biking here, but it's also really nice and convenient and easy for that person driving. Continuing to prioritize biking, walking, and public transit. This is just another great example of a downtown area that has transit through it, where we made it very safe for that person riding a bike. We've given a great streetscape for people walking, and there's great opportunity to make placemaking and for businesses to thrive and excel. We also want to focus on other points of our transportation system that haven't been considered very much. Things like our intersections. I know we hear a lot about roundabouts here in Columbia. We do have quite a few roundabouts, and I'm not arguing the safety benefits that they offer for people driving. However, roundabouts, as we design them here in Columbia, are very inconvenient and give a very they have a perception of safety that is not good, to say the least. If you are a person with children, if you are a person on a bike, if you are a person that's sight impaired or in a wheelchair, it is quite scary to try to utilize one of our roundabouts the way we design them here in Columbia. The way we design our roundabouts here in Columbia tend to be at a highway scale, but yet we're putting these in places that have neighborhoods, that have schools, that have daycares, that have grocery stores, that we know are pedestrian attractors, and yet it makes it very dangerous for people to use. And so we want to start focusing on not only the roadway, but also our intersection design. And what I've shown here in this picture is a roundabout design that is much safer than the current design we use in most of the roundabouts we have in our city. Continuing on with our recommendations, we want to prioritize access versus mobility on most of our streets. I want to make a clarification here. This is a little bit of engineer lingo. When we say, because most people, when we talk about mobility, they think about ADA access. But in this context, access is your ability to get to the things you need to get. Can you get to the grocery store? Can you get across the street? That's that access piece. Mobility, and like I said, this more engineering speak, tends to be your ability to move across a distance from point A to point B. And so when we talk about mobility, I-70 has great mobility in the way we're using these terms here, because it gets you from point A to point B wonderfully. When we look at Business Loop 70, they doesn't really prioritize either mobility or access, because you can't get anywhere you need to go in a car very well, and you certainly can't get anywhere you need to go and access the things you need to access if you're a pedestrian or a person on a bike. Again, focusing more on that access piece, it is very easy for people walking and biking to get to the places they need to go in this rendering that I've shown previously. Mobility, you can still get through this area with a motor vehicle, but it's not prioritizing your speed. It's not prioritizing how fast you can drive your car through here. You can still get across there, but it's just not prioritizing those. So it's not prioritizing that mobility term. It's really prioritizing that access term. That's not to say that there are places in our city where we need to focus more on mobility. You know, we think of things like Stadium Boulevard. We should start to focus more on mobility. But we should stop trying to do both. We really need to focus on access in 75% of the roads we have, because most of the time, the roads within Columbia, that's what we're trying to do with them. We're trying to access something. We're trying to access our home, our schools, our libraries. And so we need to start designing that way as opposed to designing for mobility through our neighborhoods. Another example of this, I already talked a little bit outside my office, but this is outside my office. It looks a little different today, obviously, but this is a neighborhood. This is, for those that don't know, this is Broadway, just a little bit west of the library. On my left, that's a park. On my right, just a little ahead, that's a daycare. Right behind me is Grant Elementary School. Right behind me is the library. This should be a place that feels very walkable, bikeable, and has great access to everything, whether it's your neighbor or any of those other amenities I talked about. But it doesn't. It's not. They have focused more heavily on mobility. So you do not feel safe crossing this street. You do not feel safe walking down the street. And you certainly don't feel safe biking on this street. You may if you are a hardened, experienced bike rider. But if you're new to biking, you're a kid, you're elderly, whatever it is, it's not designed for you. And those are most of the people that live in our community. This is an example of what we could do with Broadway. Maybe not exactly, but as you can see here, we've improved the access. This would be a great example of Forum Boulevard, the access of Forum Boulevard being improved. Currently, they're looking at widening all of Forum Boulevard to 4 lanes and making it basically another Providence, another College Boulevard, which is disheartening because there are pools there, there are neighborhoods there, there are daycares there. But instead of prioritizing that neighborhood, they are prioritizing people getting through there as quickly as possible. So we're going to destroy that neighborhood so that people don't have to sit at a stop sign for 45 seconds longer than normal during peak time, which is quite bananas. Design has to do with everything. So here I show a picture of 2 roadways. One is designed to be 20 miles an hour, but they are both set at speed limit of 20 miles an hour. I guarantee you on the top picture, we see lots of people speeding. They are late for work, they're late getting home, so they floor it to go up and down that roadway. You also on that top picture probably don't see a lot of kids playing in the street, riding their bikes up and down, kicking soccer balls around, playing catch. You really don't see that. But on the bottom picture, you do. You don't see people speeding because the design is set up such that you drive at 20 miles per hour. We wouldn't have to put a stop sign on that road and you would drive at 20 miles an hour. And I guarantee you, kids are out playing, people are out walking in this design. Now, I'm not saying we go and design every road in Columbia like the one on the bottom. My point here is design matters. And we have proof of concept for this right here in Columbia. There, on the top picture, there are plenty of roads like that around Columbia you can go look at. The bottom picture, think of Maupin. If any of you have not been on Maupin, that's essentially what Maupin looks like. And there are people walking and biking and they're driving, but they are driving calm. They become part of the neighborhood. So when you are walking and biking and using public transit, we like to say that you are part of the community. When you are driving, the community tends to be in your way and you want them out of your way. But when we design roads like this, you recognize that, oh, I am infringing on the community. And so you try to do everything you can to drive in a way that makes you as part of the community as can and not offensive to that community. So we want to see better design. Continuing on with our mobility or access versus mobility, we can still have roads that have great mobility. So getting you from point A to point B and still be safe for people walking and biking. This is an example of it. This could be, Scott Boulevard. where cars can still go a long ways. There's not many businesses, there's not many houses along this road, but people need to go from point A to point B over a long distance and want to do so very efficiently. We can design it for cars to be that way, but we can also make it safe for people biking. If you look on the sides of the road, there are raised or protected bike lanes. There's also nice wide sidewalks for people to utilize as well. So we don't have to necessarily sacrifice the way most people think we do to get what we want. And I'll run through these a little quicker. This is a little bit not as fun because I don't have cool pictures to show, but we want to simplify our street design types. We talked about street designs and what they are. Columbia has about 20 types of street design, depending on how you look at it. So that makes things very complicated within our city. Netherlands has 3. Okay, so to say that we need 20, we don't need 20, but we also probably need more than 3. Our point here is that we have way too many currently, and it makes it very complicated and difficult. It also makes it very easy for variances to occur when, say, we're designing a neighborhood, say Ash Street, and somebody comes along and says, you know what, Ash Street may have a lot of houses and driveways and families and kids and people walking their dogs along it, but let's make it, we can make it wider, we can make it faster, but that's because we have 20 types of street design that there's some different variances in there. If we shrink that down and put some caps on them, it can be a little bit better, and we can ensure that the neighborhoods and our business districts are set up so that they work the best that they can. We want to design streets based on the land use context. So if it's a neighborhood street, whether that's a residential street or a connector street or a school zone, the road should look like it. The road should feel like, oh, I'm in a neighborhood. Oh, I'm in a school zone. I should slow down. Oh, and look how easy it is for people to walk and bike. Same with the business district. We want to have different types of land use context road designs based on, is it local business? So is it things like, you know, downtown? Is it a connector area? So there's some businesses that we still need to access, but we really shouldn't be trying to put cars past here as fast as possible. And we also want to take into consideration the industrial parks that we have in Columbia, as well as parkways. So parkways would be things like Forum Boulevard. How should they be designed so that cars can move along those in an efficient manner, but still provide safe and convenient throughput for people walking or biking? This gets a little bit more technical on the street standard stuff, but we think that all travel lanes, there should only be one travel lane. So for instance, right outside my office right now, Broadway has 4 lanes of travel. There's no reason for it to have 4 lanes of travel. If you do the traffic study and volume, there's no reason for it to have 2 lanes. It can totally have 1 lane of traffic. So we think that other than things like boulevards or parkways, there should only be 1 lane. Most lane widths in our community should only be 10 feet. In some instances, 11 feet is fine. For those that on the call that don't know, I-70, their lane width is 13 feet. Currently, most of our lane widths in Columbia are also 13 feet. So we're trying to move away from designing our neighborhood roads to look like I-70 and start to actually look like neighborhood roads, which are much narrower, so people can be out on those roads. We want to minimize any new infrastructure. I talked about that building that huge road out there at Discovery Parkway. The only new infrastructure we really think should be being built currently is bike infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, and transit infrastructure. That doesn't mean you can't be maintaining roads. So we think if there's a road that needs to be updated and we need to update the travel lanes and all, that's perfectly fine. So we're focusing more on that maintenance instead of new. And we think design speeds should match desired speeds. So what we call self-enforcing design. Again, that was that picture I showed where it's like, I guarantee you nobody was driving 20 miles an hour up that one road. And so we think there should be self-enforcing design. So the speed limit should match to the design speed and the actual speed people drive. And for those that don't know, generally what we do is when we design a road, we say, okay, this road's going to be 40 miles an hour. However, the design speed on it's going to be 50 miles an hour. And that is in case somebody does decide to drive faster, that they have some room for wiggle, some room for error. However, what we've seen over the years is when you allow for that, when you allow the design speed to be higher than the posted speed limit, people actually drive it. they tend to drive that 50 miles an hour. And so it makes it very unsafe. We want to maximize things like sidewalk widths. We think they should be anywhere from 6 to 10 feet in our community. Most often we do 5 feet in Columbia. We think it should be much wider. We think buffer zone is that area between the sidewalk and the road. They should be anywhere from 5 to 10 feet, depending on that street design. Lots of pedestrian crossings. Those that know me know that I have a strong opinion about jaywalking, and basically you should be able to cross street anywhere you want. You're a human. You're not a machine that needs to be guided up, down, and around. And if we designed our roadways to be narrower with calmer traffic, you could basically cross anywhere. Anywhere could be considered a safe crossing. Bike lanes, 6 to 10 feet, depending on the street type. Currently, we do a lot of 5 feet bike lanes in our community. We do have some 6 and wider. And depending on the type of street, if it's a neighborhood street, a painted bike lane is probably just fine. But as we get up to things that are much bigger and wider, like a Scott Boulevard, there should be some protection there. That should be a protected bike lane, not just a white stripe, because that white paint isn't protecting anybody. I'm gonna jump over that. And then this is very nerdy for some of you, but we really think our city should adopt NACDO road design guide. Currently, engineers use a thing called AASHTO and MUTCD. So these are design books that tell them like recommendations and gives them guidelines on how things should be designed. The AASHTO guide and the MUT, we'll mostly stick to the AASHTO guide, was that guide that was really developed in the 1940s and really designed for highways, but it's yet been in kind of transformed to be utilized for neighborhoods, and it's not the best fit. Whereas NACDO tends to look at what's the best fit. Is this street design good for a neighborhood, and this is how you should do it, business district, and this is how you should do it. And so we think they should adopt that design guideline as well. So I did a lot of talking. I talked really fast. Gabby didn't jump in with anybody asking any questions, but that's the end of my little chat. I want to open it up and hear any thoughts or questions that any of you might have. So we can have a little bit of a discussion for the next 12 minutes that we have here. And I'll end my screen sharing unless I need to reference back to a different picture. So opening it all up. I see, is it Deanna? I hope I pronounced that correctly. Feel free to speak or type in the chat, whichever is easiest for you.
All right. I am going to be 74, and I moved from Fulton. And one of the things I noticed when I first came to Missouri is we have terrible roads in the country. I lived in Oregon for a long time. They have a wide shoulder between the ditch and the pavement so that I could walk the 5 miles into the small town where I worked with my guide dog and get there safely because there was room. When I moved to Missouri, I lived on J first in a rental, and my vet was only 100 yards away, but I couldn't get there because it wasn't safe. There was nothing but a ditch and very fast moving traffic. There was no place for me to walk. So when I came into Columbia, I looked really hard to find a place we could live because my husband is now in a wheelchair. So we had to leave our 2-story farmhouse out in the country. I've been totally blind since I was 8 years old. So I'm a walker. And the neighborhood I picked has nice sidewalks, but there's really nothing close by. And I have a 20-minute walk to catch the nearest bus. And the minute I moved to town, they changed the bus system and went back to a wheel rather than the grid pattern they were trying to develop. And that changed the paratransit districts. And so not only did I have a long walk, and if the weather was really bad, that would be difficult, but I had no other option to get anywhere. So I went to the city council and I stood up and I said, look, I picked my home because it was on a paratransit route, because I needed to depend on paratransit and the bus. If my husband's continuing health deteriorates to the point where he can no longer do his own transfers in and out of his wheelchair and can't drive, and you're messing up, my aging in place home, because I had to hunt really hard to find a house that was all on one level with wide enough doorways that he could get through with his walker or his wheelchair. And so I don't live in a particularly great part of town, but it was a newer house and it was all on one level. And you've just messed up. And I've spent all my retirement funds to buy this new house. And so that was my problem in Columbia. They backed down and they said if you were on the paratransit and the bus moved, you could be grandfathered in. But that didn't help anyone moving into, say,
Right.
my neighborhood, who may have the same problems I have.
Right.
But if they didn't live here then, um, it was like a token. And I think that's what we get a lot is tokenism, where we got a few audible traffic signals because a good friend of mine, when there was a little bit of a surplus, went down and said, hey, College Avenue is really dangerous. We need an audible traffic signal there. And so we got a few, and that put us a little bit up from the surrounding towns, but not a whole lot. We still have a community that is ruled by the car, and
Right.
it is extremely dangerous for me to even walk to the supermarket from where I live up on Range Line, because there are sections where I have to walk in the gutter, and if people park there, then I have to walk around them out into the lane. It's a mess, but
Yeah.
we do have to eat.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. I think at least on this call, you've got a lot of people who really understand what you're having to say and having to deal with. And really sorry that, I mean, I have a friend here in Columbia who moved here, I think about the same time I did. And she moved here because she's sight impaired and and I think this is we like to talk a big game here in Columbia. Like I said, we have the complete streets policy. So you would think, oh, we're going to have all this great infrastructure for walking and biking. But when it comes to the actual implementation, or as I like to say, if you want to see a city's true priorities, look at its budget. We don't tend to follow through on that stuff here. We don't tend to look at our neighbors and our community and say, where are people struggling the most? And let's fix that thing.
Yeah,
We like
and
to
they
say
put
that
all
we
the
do.
low
Yeah.
income housing off in places where you can't get anywhere from there.
Right.
So how are the people ever going to get jobs and
Right.
start contributing to the community?
Right. You're absolutely right. And that's what one thing that's forgotten with, when we talk about housing and affordable housing is if we build affordable housing out, on the far reaches of our town and the transportation costs are high, how affordable is that housing really? So we need to make sure we think about that as well. Those houses that you're talking about being built on the edges of town, their transportation costs are massive, or they spend a lot of their time, or they put themselves in danger to get to the needs that they have, such as hospitals or jobs or groceries. And so you raise a
Mhm.
very good point, and hopefully we can fix all of that.
Okay, well, I'm with you on that one. And I am an activist. I always have been.
Great. Anybody else have any questions or anything? Happy to take them.
This is Frank. I got a bunch in the chat.
Oh, you do? Sorry, Frank. Normally, so number one, mobility equals automobility. I think that's a good way to phrase it. We spend an enormous but still inadequate amount of money on retrofitting streets for traffic calming. Good design will save money. Guests at hotels on Clark can't go to the restaurants across the street. That's 100% accurate, which is wild that you have to drive your car to get across the street. Most cities, including Columbia, grow out and likely will for a while. The city requires that these developments meet sewer, etc. standards. Can we require good design the same way we require sewers? You know, Frank, that's a great question. That's something I've been thinking about, you know, when we talk about growth and annexation. And one of the things I've often thought is, what if when a community is built, you know, a development, I know there's lots of development out on Gillespie Bridge Road right now, and at some point we're probably going to annex those communities in to Columbia. But what we say is, when that community is built, it has to at least meet the standards that we have today. So, you know, a lot of times people will build out in the county and they won't necessarily meet the standards like you're saying here in our in your question. They won't meet the standards because they know it's cheaper to build that way. And then at some point we have to annex that in. And then after we've annexed it in, we realize, oh my gosh, the street design standards aren't up to what we normally like to have. And so then we have to spend money to go fix them. And so, yeah, that's something I've thought about. I don't know where we're at in getting there to requiring those sorts of things, but I agree it's something we should discuss. Jackson, oh yeah, I didn't even know Jackson. Jackson says in the chat, it is sad that the buses are closed for today and tomorrow, especially when the plows, garbage trucks, police, cruisers, and more are running like normal. If people choose the bus rather than driving in these winter conditions, some of today's crashes might be prevented. Completely agree. I think people forget why we actually plow the streets. It's not so people can get to their jobs or, you know, go out and go sledding. The real reason we plow the streets is so first responders can get where they need to go. So if there's an issue at a house, a fire truck can get there, police officers can get there. And, you know, so then they choose to still go drive, which is incredibly unsafe. But yet we know, like you're saying here in your chat, Jackson, we know that if you use public transit, even on snowy days like today, it's much, much safer. I believe it's on any given day, it's 18 times safer to use public transit than it is to drive a car. But yet we tend to focus all of our money into the car and all of our efforts in the car, and we leave our transportation system behind, which is, we can have a whole nother hour discussion about why a city shouldn't do that and why they should lift up their public transit system. Elke in the chat, what is Local Motion's next step? She also referring to Frank's question about the sewers. I'll read this real quick. When the city allows sewer lines to be connected, they have to be brought up to city standards first. Not so for roads. I didn't know that, Elke. Thank you very much. So what is our next step? So right now, we are developing some of our internal campaign materials. And once we get those kind of brought up, we're going to start going on a campaign and doing things like this, but maybe in front of different organizations such as Optimist clubs, trying to build support, reaching out to other non-for-profits to build support. We are also looking to put together a list of things we would like to see change. So a lot of what I talked about in my presentation, things we want to see different, and then trying to put that together into a policy piece that can be adopted by the city. So basically putting together what we want to see adopted by the city, the language we want to see, and the types of things we want to see in a street design standard, and then getting a bunch of support, submitting that to council, finding some council people to sponsor the policy. And that part's on hold until after the election, but getting that passed. And hopefully what we'll find out is maybe that within that policy, we can either direct city staff to update the road design standards that we currently use. But I'm sympathetic to the lack of resources that they have as far as staff time and the amount of work they already have. But we could also reach out to a consultant to do the design work to figure out what the new road design standards are based on what we would ask for in a new complete streets policy. Thank you, Elke. All right. I'm going to say any more questions one last time. I really appreciate everybody getting on the call today. It's a beautiful snowy day out there. I hope many of you are able to get out there and enjoy the snowy weather. I was able to make it into the office. I did not drive, And so I found it much more convenient. It looked like I was having a much better time too than a few people I saw driving to get here. So I hope everybody gets out and if you're able to shovel your sidewalks, I'd like to encourage you to shovel your sidewalks. If you are feeling spry and can shovel your sidewalks, help some of your neighbors to shovel their sidewalks. And if you're unable to shovel your sidewalks, please reach out to somebody. We would be happy to figure out a way to get your sidewalk shoveled. Oh, and Caroline jumped in the chat here, unrelated to anything serious. A source tells me MUPD just pulled over a group of dudes who were skiing behind a truck. All right. Well, I went out for a bike ride this morning and MUPD got on their speaker or whatever and told me I was doing a good job, but I don't think my biking around on a fat bike was as dangerous as being pulled behind a truck. But anyway, thank you for that, Caroline. Well, everybody, thank you very much. We have another one of these Let's Chat in a month. I don't know the topic. Gabby, if you do, jump on real quick, but we hope you can join us for our next Let's Chat, which will be a month from now. And have a great day, everybody.